Com check? Com check? Communications check? Does that work? Trying to get things organized. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, dear. Hi. Chief is. You gonna turn it off? Okay, yeah. The way we usually do this is Mary will stay down there until she's sure nobody else is coming.
Okay.
Everything else is know the crowd, so when she comes up, we'll get started.
Okay. Yep. No problem. I'm good to go. There she is. I know. So the fire marshal will be on your case. You get any more people?
How did you guys all get in here? I know, I am, yes. Welcome. We're so happy to see you all here today. I hope you were able to find a parking spot close enough. Anyway, who's here for the first time ever? Welcome. See what you can see? We say the words Dr. Joshua Smith and people come up here. Anyway, I'd like to introduce retired Vice Admiral George Emery, who is going to do our introductions today.
Okay. The finest library director of the finest library in the state of Maine. Unfortunately for us, we all know it's true. At least all those of us who have been here once, at least. It's my pleasure today to introduce Joshua, Dr. Joshua Smith, author of this wonderful book you see right in front of you, Making Maine in the War of 1812. Josh and I met about a decade ago at the Maine Historical Society where something similar was happening. It was the 200th anniversary of the glorious, well, glorious is perhaps an extension, but the good job the very tiny young Navy did during that Second War of Independence. Josh was there talking a lot about what you're going to hear about today, and George Don, anybody remember George Don? He's spoken to us before. Revolution on the Hudson, I think. He was there with, the three of us were panelists at that meeting. It was just a great opportunity, and I heard at that conference how much this guy here, Josh, knew about Maine, and later found out he was writing a book on Maine and statehood and the War of 1812. And I said, I got to read that book. And you know what? Today I'm going to have an opportunity to hear about that book, and next week I hope to read all of that book. And you're going to have an opportunity too. I was going to tell, I must tell you that Josh has been in Maine for the last 2 or 3 days, and he has been telling people about this book. So I hope you haven't heard it already. Josh's degrees come from as far away as St. Andrews in Scotland. That's where he got his master's degree. And he got his doctorate at the University of Maine. He is a professor of naval history at the United States Maritime Academy at Kings Point, New York. He's also the director of the America's Maritime Museum, which is owned or part of the property at Kings Bay. He's a terrific guy. And it's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to have a reunion, a 10-year reunion with Josh today. Dr. Joshua Smith.
Thank you, sir. Very kind. Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I live on Long Island in New York, but I really like Maine. I've spent a lot of time in Maine. I'm not a Maine native. I'm a Cape Codder originally, but any chance I get to get back to Maine is always just a real joy. It feels like home. And of course, I'd like to thank Mary Lou and the Louis T. Graves Library for having me here. That's very kind. And a special thanks to Vice Admiral George Emery for encouraging me, not only loaning or sharing documents from his personal collection, which is considerable, but a couple of years ago, he may not remember, but there was an email exchange in which he sort of gave me a kick in the pants, said, hey, when are you going to get that book done? And then COVID came along, and all of a sudden I had a lot of writing time on my hands. So, but it has been a 30-year project to write this book. I was a young man when it started. I am no longer that person. I've got a couple things I need to say before I really get launched into this. First off, I'm happy to present, but I'm also really looking forward to questions and discussions after I finish, so please feel free. I also need to thank the Border Historical Society in Eastport, Maine. Well, why would I need to thank them? They didn't have to, but they stepped forward to provide what's called a subvention for printing this book. That is to say, I already had a contract with the University of Massachusetts Press to produce this, and those nice folks up in Eastport came up with money to subsidize the publication. And let me tell you, it was $1,500, but $1,500 in Eastport, a lot of money, right? And I really appreciate just that they supported me and were very excited about this. The other thing I have to say is, yes, I am a federal employee. Don't hate me for that. But I have to say, because this is going live or it's going to be recorded, that while I am an employee of the federal government, that this presentation in no way represents the views of the United States government or of the U.S. Maritime Administration or the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. Done. Okay. So this was a 30-year project, and what happened is actually my undergraduate degree was in history from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and I came back to this country swearing I would never read a history book again, and did what New England boys are supposed to do when they haven't quite got things figured out, which was I ran away to sea. But I went to Maine Maritime and I sailed to Greenland on the Bowdoin and worked on cruise ships and ferry boats and got a little bored with that. But and eventually did what? I became a maritime historian. So I put those two together. But during my time at Castine, you can't help but notice when you're walking around Castine, there are all these fortifications left over from the War of 1812, and it sort of set my imagination on fire. And I couldn't really get the real dirt on what had happened in the War of 1812, and of course Castine was actually occupied by the British. There was a lot of smuggling, there were spies, and all sorts of exciting things. But I couldn't find the stuff I want to find. So I started, when I was on leave from the ships I worked on, I started going to do research with the original documents, and 30 years later, here I am. And it's been fascinating. And so my goal was to write a history of Maine and the War of 1812 that included the whole, what's now state of Maine, everything from Elliott to Holton and Eastport to Vassalboro, Wiscasset, Castine, Augusta, Waterville, and the whole state. And one of the things I discovered is that statehood for Maine was actually a very unpleasant experience. We're talking riots in the streets, first selectmen getting punched at the town meeting, and they weren't even arguing over snow plowing contracts. and a lot of real unpleasantness, neighbor versus neighbor. And this gets swept up in the War of 1812 to a bigger discussion about whether New England should secede from the nation because Massachusetts, of which we were a part, didn't want to be involved in this war. Massachusetts doesn't end up seceding from the nation, but Maine ends up seceding from Massachusetts. So things do happen. And it is an unpleasant experience. So let me read just a few lines to give from the preface that gives you some ideas about how ugly a process this was. Today, Americans obsess about disorder in the nation. Politics have become bitterly partisan, the news media blatantly take sides, and urban elites and their rural counterparts vie for moral ascendancy. There are widespread concerns about riots, coups, and what role the states and federal government have in maintaining order or quelling dissent. Some alarmists even predict the end of American democracy. My message to the reader is fear not. Well, actually, with the news today, maybe not quite so much. But you know, I think we do have to remember that the Republic has witnessed all these travails before and has not only survived, but I think we can argue has generally thrived. I mean, we are the wealthiest and most powerful nation on the planet, right? So, but I think people are surprised when I talk about how things used to be, and my evidence lies in this detailed analysis of Maine's search for a new identity separate from Massachusetts from roughly 1805 to 1820. And the choice of Maine probably surprises a lot of people because I think most Americans know it as the land of quaint villages. Well, we might be in one, I'm not sure. Moxie, lobster rolls, and LL Bean. It's sort of a political and economic backwater. I don't think that's unfair. Maine is not a wealthy or very important place politically, tucked in an obscure corner of the nation. But Maine in the early 1800s was a dynamic place, well placed for international trade with the British Empire, with a rapidly growing population. And increasingly its citizens sought independence from Massachusetts, ultimately becoming a separate state in 1820s. Why did Mainers seek separation from a large, prosperous, and important state like Massachusetts? In part, its leading citizens decided that the time was ripe for them to take control. Another growing factor was a growing perception that Massachusetts treated Maine as a colony to be commercially exploited and its inhabitants disdained as uncouth rustics. Now, the fun thing is I talked about this on Wednesday night at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and in a presentation which I basically made fun of them for the whole hour. And what was even more fun is I ambushed them because I pointed out, and I scheduled it this way, and I didn't tell the organizers that it was March 15th, that this is the anniversary of in 1820 when the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was ripped in two, and Maine became a state on March 15th. And, you know, they were agog. It never had even occurred to them. So, and so there is this Maine-Massachusetts thing, which we'll be talking about a bit today. But to get back to the preface there, you know, a lot of unhappiness now with politics, a lot of unhappiness then too. And if you think things are bad now, well, consider this. The former Secretary of the Treasury has not been shot and killed by the sitting Vice President of the United States. And of course, I'm talking about Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr in Weehawken, New Jersey, right? So we haven't gotten to that point. So be glad you didn't live in the Jefferson administration, I guess. So Massachusetts does attempt to impose its ideas, or what I call ideals, or the Massachusetts ideal, on the Maine frontier. And it really doesn't fly up here. So this Massachusetts ideal is pretty much comes from the mind of John Adams, prominent Massachusetts lawyer, second president of the United States. I think even the guy who founded the United States Navy in a way. So he was around. Yeah, he was definitely there for that. And John Adams is a guy who likes to crow to anybody who will listen, probably Abigail the most, poor Abigail. But also to the King of England or people in France or basically anybody who will listen, that Massachusetts is a superior society and that the sooner the rest of the world looks like Massachusetts, the better. And so this is the guy who creates, in 1780, during the American Revolution, the state constitution for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And this is still during the American Revolution, and it has some unusual features. For example, religion. And this is still the state constitution of Massachusetts, by the way, although the religious provision has fallen by the wayside. The Massachusetts Constitution provided for a state-supported church, Protestant church, by the way. Today we would call them Congregationalists, but we didn't back then. The book comes down a little hard on Congregationalists, but then again, I'm a Methodist, not my problem. So it seems odd to us, though, as Americans, that states support, specific faiths. But Massachusetts wasn't alone in this. Actually, several states do. And the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, when it talks about separation of church and state, actually that purely applies to the federal government, actually. It did not apply to the states. And Massachusetts will keep this provision until about 1833, I think, is when they finally step away from it, mostly because it had become a real nuisance to enforce. The other odd thing about the Massachusetts Constitution is that it really fiercely defends property rights, which is to say it favors the wealthy over the poor. And we know that in Maine because there were a lot of poor people, still are a lot of poor people in Maine, but back then many of them were squatters who did not own the land they tilled. And Massachusetts was quite happy to pay off its Revolutionary War debts by selling off huge blocks of land in Maine to wealthy land speculators who then sold it to farmers. Now, Massachusetts favored those speculators by essentially giving them a free pass. They had to pay almost no taxes on that land. However, as soon as a farmer bought, say, that same 40 acres, the taxation on it increased by a factor of 3. So poor people had to pay more taxes than rich people for land. Okay? So I think that should be concerning to all of us. And another way that wealth plays into the Massachusetts Constitution in a way that certainly impacts Maine is that state senators in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, there wasn't just a couple senators from each county, or certainly wasn't based on population. How John Adams arranged this is that the number of senators a county had was a reflection of the assessed wealth in that county. So you can imagine Suffolk County, Boston, Essex County with Salem, ooh, whole lot of wealth there and a whole lot of senators. How does Washington County in Maine play out in that formula? Not so good, right? So there are some problems, and quite unusually for a state constitution written that early, it has strong executive power. And we know that because in 1787, some farmers in western Massachusetts challenged the Boston status quo in what's called Shays's Rebellion. And they had some points that taxation was heavy and that they were oppressed. They didn't like the fact that the state capital remained in Boston. One of the interesting things that happens because of the American Revolution is that state capitals tend to get moved to the center of states. And which is more democratic and more accessible. Massachusetts does not. It remains in Boston, whereas these Western farmers want to move it to, quel horror, Worcester. It's enough to make you want to drop your polar kohler, as they say. And the great and the good in Boston have a very direct answer to Daniel Shays and his folks from Worcester. And that is, they raise an army and they gun them down, they imprison them, and they almost hang a bunch of them, although they stop short of that. And yeah, Worcester is not a good answer. And in their more reasonable moments, the Bostonians could point out that actually, this is an important point, Boston is the center of the Commonwealth if you take into account the District of Maine. Right? If you want to get from Kennebunk to Boston, that's pretty easy, especially by boat. But if you had to go to Worcester, that's an entirely different thing. So Maine does play a role in all this stuff. So, okay, there's also a social element to this Massachusetts ideal. And that is, in Massachusetts, which has been settled for a long time, there was this idea that ordinary folk should pay deference to their betters, what you might call the great and the good. So the wealthy expected to be nominated to office without really having to run for office, and to also tell you how to vote, essentially. And you could tell where you lay in Massachusetts society by your militia rank, or if you were a congregational clergy member, if you were a graduate of Harvard. But in Massachusetts, it was expected you would toe this line. This doesn't play so well in the backwoods of Maine. People not willing to accept this on face value, and this is very disturbing to the people in Boston. They are surprised that Mainers don't want to line up and do exactly as they want. And there is certainly a prejudice against people from Maine in Massachusetts, especially in Boston. The one quote I'll plague you with is a Bostonian refers to the people in Maine as, and I quote, a people naturally bad and violent.
That's us.
So a lot of Mainers don't care for the Massachusetts ideal, and probably the first prominent person to come up and contest this is a guy he's originally from New Hampshire, but after the Revolution, he moves to the Kennebec River Valley, and he's a fellow you might have heard of. His name is Henry Dearborn, and he's a congressman from Maine, and a militia general, and American War of Independence veteran. And he goes to Congress in the 1790s, and he's an outsider to Boston. Bostonians don't care for him, and he doesn't really care for them. And he actually, when he goes to Congress, he starts bumping into this ginger-haired fellow from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson. And he buys into Jefferson's ideas of equality for all white men of property, and religious pluralism, and the power of small government, and Dearborn buys into it, and he'll actually be Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of War for 8 years. I think he's our longest serving Secretary of War, which essentially would be Secretary of Defense today. And a big sign that he that he had defected, and he is treated as an apostate by people from Boston. The big signal he sends that he isn't buying into the Massachusetts ideal anymore is when he takes his son, Henry Alexander Scammell Dearborn, out of college at Williams College in Massachusetts and transfers him to the College of William and Mary in Virginia. This is a complete and unthinkable rejection of all things Massachusetts, because if Massachusetts is vain about one thing, It is the quality of its higher educational institutions. And to go to William and Mary is just, I think it's absolutely mind-blowing for the Boston people. They can't get over it. So Dearborn is in Washington, though, as part of the Jefferson administration, and a protege of his comes to the fore, a guy born not so far from here, born in Scarborough, named William King. And William King will very cleverly place himself politically as a leader for a Maine statehood movement. And he does that. And mind you, he is a politician, so be prepared to be cynical because William King will tell you whatever it is you want to hear. He's on your side, I assure you, right? And so he uses the squatters quite cleverly, and there are a lot of squatters, right? And they have lots and lots of babies who become voters too, right? And he promises them, I'm going to do something to get you your land. That gets him a lot of votes and a lot of political clout. He also argues for religious reform. The idea, so the problem with Massachusetts is there's a state-supported religion, which means everybody here pays for the Congregational Church out of taxes. And if you want to be a Baptist or a Catholic, which is really scary stuff back then, or a Methodist like me, you have to dig in a little deeper. On top of the paying for the Congregational Church, you have to pay for your church too, which is a real hardship. So William King is able to overturn this in 1810 in something that's interesting, that this act has two different names depending where you live. In Maine, it's called the Toleration Act, whereas in Old Massachusetts, it's known as the Religious Freedom Act. So he's making inroads, and it's making people in Massachusetts very uncomfortable. And then this War of 1812 comes along, and it ratchets up the tension even more. So the War of 1812, immensely divisive anyways. This is a war fought, as I say, for free trade and sailors' rights. Sailors' rights, meaning Americans don't like the fact, or at least some Americans don't like the fact, that American boys are being forced to serve in the British Royal Navy. And that includes a local guy named Elias Hutchins, who gets impressed to serve on board a British war vessel, and he doesn't come back for 17 years. So, and it pretty much shatters his whole life, and in fact, he'll die in the poorhouse here in Kennebunkport, maybe Kennebunk, actually. So the thing to know is that Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, opposes this war mightily. And the Congregational clergy will badger you from their pulpit about how this war is wicked and sinful, and if you support it or send your sons to it or even pay your taxes, you are a miserable miscreant sinner, of which I have no doubts anyway. So. The governor also refuses to cooperate with the American general in charge of defending New England, who is actually now Henry Dearborn, which makes him even less popular with the Bostonians, and refuses to share the militia. Ain't gonna do it. There are lots of meetings throughout the District of Maine. There's a local one. I don't think it's actually in Kennebunk, but to give you a sense of how unhappy people are, I'll read this little bit. So many communities sent letters directly to President Madison. I love that. That even very tiny, Robbinston, Maine sends a letter directly to the president. They are not to be deterred. And some towns declared their support for the war, such as Frankfort, whose leading Republicans scolded the Massachusetts governor and resolved to, quote, protect and defend our own government against all its enemies, whether external or internal. hinting at civil war here, right? York County citizens warned Madison that the Federalists would reintroduce British rule, dramatically forecasting that the storm of civil discord is gathering, the thunder roars at a distance, the lightning gleams on the dim mantle of night. Those are some real purple prose for you there. Meanwhile, Federalist towns such as Lyman wrote to Madison and with some really interesting spelling, I might add, to most heartily say that we disapprove of the present war. John Low's signature topped Lyman's petition. He became a leading critic of the war and maybe one of the most radical Federalists who opposed the war in the entire District of Maine. Among his fears was that the war would lead to an alliance with Napoleon Bonaparte, from which evil may the good Lord deliver us, and that seaborne trade was also a common theme, with Biddeford's selectmen invoking the memory of prosperous times, asking, why has our gold become dim? Why are those happy, thrice happy times changed? We see no sufficient reason for it. The town of Wells echoed Biddeford's concerns and accused Republicans of having impoverished the nation. Columbia in Washington County considered the war unnecessary, unjust, and ruinous, while North Yarmouth argued that the war would introduce poverty and wretchedness and that Maine ere long will have nothing left but rocks, ruins, and demagogues. So, a lot of strong words getting thrown around. There are riots in places like Augusta, Castine, and Eastport. People are discouraging and sometimes beating up military recruiters and interfering with people sending their sons to join the Navy or the Army. There is the British blockade the entire coast, which means about this time of year back then was known as the starving time. And as people begin to look into their larders and pantries in March, things are getting pretty thin, right? And the usual answer was to buy flour that would be brought up by ship from Virginia. Well, with the British blockade, that can't happen. And while it doesn't happen in the immediate neighborhood around here, especially in down East Maine, families are starving to death. And that's pretty fierce. And even, you know, there are lawyers in Ellsworth complaining that they can't feed their children. People who clearly are not poor are starving as well. So it's pretty ugly. And consider this, to support the war, taxation rose 330%. April 15th is coming up. How would you feel about paying 330 times what you pay now in taxes, right? It's pretty grim. People don't have that kind of cash. Disease is stalking the land. And then in September of 1814, the British finally come crashing into Maine and invade the Penobscot River. They have a brief battle in Hamden, where the crew of the USS Adams has landed because their ship is trying to get away from the British. And Captain Morris calls for the local militia to come out and defend his ship. They dutifully do it, and they are woefully unprepared, and the British sweep resistance aside with, you know, without breaking a sweat, essentially. It's pretty grim. What's interesting is that the crew of the Adams runs away, as everybody else does, because they don't want to be captured, and they walk through the woods to get to Waterville, and they eventually walk all the way to Kittery, and their commander is just amazed that nobody deserted. And he dutifully reports this to Washington. But he really shouldn't have been amazed, because about 80% of the Adams's crew was from York County. They were just walking home. There was no reason to desert, right? So that's where they wanted to go anyways. So so now Eastern Maine is occupied, and Massachusetts refuses to do anything about it. And the federal government is broke and can't do anything about it. And it's a really miserable situation where a lot of Mainers, faced with a difficult decision, you can resist and have your home and all your worldly goods burned and destroyed by the British, or you can knuckle under and just try and get by. And of course, the answer is you just got to get by. You know, if you've got 8 children, you can't have your house burned, or whatever. A very difficult time out there, which I won't go into detail, but it's all in the book. If you want to take it out from the library, you don't have to buy the book. Just read it, right? What you have in 1814 is a lot of unhappiness, and Massachusetts being very active in saying, we don't like this war, we think a lot of the things that happen are unconstitutional, so it calls for a convention of the New England states to convene in Hartford, Connecticut, and the fear is that this convention will call for New England to secede from the country and become an independent nation. This is a scary time in U.S. history. At about the same time, there's a meeting in Portland, though, where William King gets together with a bunch of his cronies, and they talk about secession too. And they're like, well, if Massachusetts won't defend us, and if the federal government can't defend us, maybe the time has come for Massachusetts to give us up and for Maine to become an independent state and look after its own affairs, because we clearly can't trust Boston to do that for us. And so December of 1814 is really where the statehood movement really takes off, because Massachusetts, far from being ideal, is actually behaving in treasonous ways. I mean, and it's way worse than just the Hartford Convention. The governor of Massachusetts actually sends a representative, a lawyer from Ellsworth, to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and asks for British military assistance in case Massachusetts does secede. And he's very careful. Caleb Strong's a lawyer. He's a smart fellow. He says, we don't want redcoats. Don't send troops. But if we become independent, we would really like British arms to support Massachusetts' independence. So this is even uglier in Maine, where people catch hold of this, that Massachusetts is being treasonous. And so people who are pro-Massachusetts are sort of talking about gathering up arms for Massachusetts to revolt. And other people who are loyal to Washington, like William King and most of the statehood people, are talking about gathering up arms to defend themselves in case Massachusetts secedes. So if a civil war started in the United States in 1814, 1815, it was going to start in Maine. Okay? Very, very nasty stuff. And again, people beating each other up in the streets and shouting at each other, but also muttering about, get your guns together, boys, because it's going to be exciting. Happily, the war just ends. A peace gets signed in Ghent in Belgium on Christmas Eve of 1814. That news gets to Maine by February 14th, and then the British go away. But Maine has been put on this path to statehood by William King. And he's maneuvering and constantly badgering Massachusetts about this and doing all sorts of political things to get Massachusetts to allow Maine to secede. And of course, he wants to become Maine's first governor, and everybody knows that. And nobody's, well, some people are concerned about it. John Adams doesn't like William King and says he's a dangerous demagogue who's gonna rip the Commonwealth apart. And he's not wrong. So, Massachusetts doesn't resist much because it has its own political problems, and King is able to use his influence in Washington to change maritime law, actually, so that Maine vessels aren't taxed so heavily, because the law worked that as long as we were part of Massachusetts, a boat from Kennebunkport could go as far south as New Jersey before having to put into port and have its papers checked. Under the old laws, if Maine became a separate state, you could only travel from Kennebunkport, say, to Newburyport, and you'd have to put in and pay to have your papers looked at, and for anchorage and dockage and all that stuff. So King, in this Navigation Act, is engineering a way for coastal Mainers who had resisted the statehood idea to bring them into the fold. And it works. Places like Kennebunkport, which had been firmly against statehood, come around when this law gets changed. And at the same time that King is doing this, his friends, newspaper editors, and others are trying to whip up Maine voters to vote for statehood. And here's a great quote from a newspaper of the day. Massachusetts is a tyrannical stepmother who wishes to cramp your energies, fleece you of your wealth, and reduce you to the most abject state of colonial vassalage. So, yeah, more purple prose, right? But you can see people are winding themselves up to do this. And in 1819, this does happen. Mainers vote for statehood. And Massachusetts is fine. Okay, now it has to go to the U.S. Congress, and you have until March 15th of 1820 to get Congress to approve this. And nobody thinks this is going to be a big problem until, Congress being Congress, never happy to just keep things simple, somebody in Congress says, well, let's link Maine's statehood to Missouri's statehood. Oh, and by the way, Missouri should come in as a slave state to provide balance. This gets very, very complicated. And I'm sorry to report that most Maine politicians have very little qualms about Missouri becoming a slave state if it means they're going to gain office in a new state of Maine. One of the few objectors who does take the high ground for once is actually William King, who has some really interesting brothers, one of whom is a fellow named Rufus King, who had left Maine as a young man and became a senator from New York. In fact, he was elected before he'd actually moved to New York, I think. Why you should know this is that Hillary Clinton did the same thing, using Rufus King as the precedent, right? She didn't have any New York connections, really. And Rufus King is actually the most prominent Federalist in the nation. And while Federalists get a bad rap in general, the one thing Federalists get right is they don't like slavery, and they consider it a stain on the nation. So Rufus's good ideas about slavery spill over onto his stepbrother, William King, so William King, is anti-slavery, but a lot of his supporters, again, will sell slavery if it means that they get office in Maine, which I find disappointing. Okay, so with hours to spare, I think on March 14th of 1820, Congress does approve statehood for Maine, and it becomes the 23rd state in the nation. William King, by a huge majority, becomes its first governor. Nobody is surprised. Nobody's surprised when he breaks all the campaign promises he made either. But in fact, our first governor doesn't last very long. He spent 20 years subverting the Massachusetts order and I think having a jolly old time doing it. And then he found the actual job of administrating a state actually kind of tedious. And 14 months in, he's trying to pass some very Massachusetts-like legislation where he wants to use state funds to promote, I think, industrial development in Maine. And the farmers who compose most of the legislature balk and say no and heck no. And William King says, well, fine, then I resign. 14 months. Really not a great record. And in fact, I have some issues with Maine's rather wonderful motto of dirigo, right, which is I lead, because I don't think Maine really does lead. That in fact, in many ways, it remains completely obsessed with Massachusetts. And I've got some very good evidence for that, and that would be the Maine State House, which, while it's built out of Maine granite, is designed by an architect from Boston, Bulfinch, who also designed the Massachusetts State House, and basically it's a carbon copy of the Massachusetts State House. So while we say boo on Massachusetts, keep on looking to Massachusetts for cues. And another example would be something coming up next month, Patriots Day. Only Maine and Massachusetts celebrate Patriots Day in April. Here's another example for you. How many of you are Red Sox fans? Probably a bunch. Okay. How many of you have complained about Massachusetts summer people making so much traffic around here? All right. So the truth is Maine doesn't really make a clean break with Massachusetts. It has this conflicted sort of viewpoint where we still take our cues from Massachusetts, and there are very few things that Maine does lead in. There are two movements where Maine does lead in, and one is temperance, and I'll drink to that. And the other that is quite noble is actually it's a Mainer who lives in Upper York County, who basically founds the American pacifist movement, which later becomes the American pacifist movement, which is still around today. And I'm not saying we all have to be pacifists. I just admire the ideals, even if they're maybe perhaps not so practical, unfortunately. So in conclusion, Maine emerges from all this tension and anxiety and near civil war and does succeed in becoming a state, but it will remain ambivalent about Massachusetts. The funny thing is that Massachusetts will take this same event, statehood for Maine, and Massachusetts will completely reinvent itself. For starters, Massachusetts, with Maine gone, has to have a constitutional convention because half of its territory is now gone. And Massachusetts decides to reshape itself and move away from that old Massachusetts ideal. For starters, the amendments in 1820 to their constitution allow Boston to become a city. Okay? No longer just a town with selectmen, but a city, a whole different thing. Massachusetts in 1833 will drop the state religious thing. In the 1840s, will be the first state to drop mandatory militia drill. And along with these political reforms, there's economic changes moving into industrialization, but maybe even more important is that, again, in this seminal year of 1820, Massachusetts people congregate in Plymouth on the 200th anniversary of the Pilgrims' landing at Plymouth Rock. And they decide that Massachusetts will now have a new moral imperative, walking away from the old Massachusetts ideal, that will make it central to the entire American historical experience. And that will be, Plymouth Rock, it's going to be Bunker Hill, It's going to be Henry Wadsworth Longfellow writing poems about Paul Revere's Ride. And even more than that, an attorney from New Hampshire named Daniel Webster will speak at Plymouth and say that the real thing that Massachusetts has to do for this nation to take moral leadership of the entire nation is to wipe away this stain of slavery. And so Massachusetts becomes a leader, not Maine. And Massachusetts will become a moral leader, and my evidence is from the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln, oh, by the way, Mayflower descendant, in 1863 puts into effect the Emancipation Proclamation. Some say end slavery. It's a little more complex than that. And in that very same year, he also declares Thanksgiving a federal holiday. Massachusetts had now completely won. It was undoubtedly the moral exemplar for the whole nation. And in my mind, it kind of still has that attitude, which is fine. Somebody has to do that. So, whereas Maine, Maine does fine. I love Maine. But I don't think the nation looks to it for leadership. And this does all emerge from this sort of horrific experience in the War of 1812. Although I will say, Admiral Emery, the U.S. Navy does do rather well. So, on that note, I'd like to conclude my part, but I'd love to entertain questions, concerns, hurled insults. What do you got? Yes, sir.
What were the mechanics of the vote for Mainers to leave? I mean, who was entitled to vote? Was it like territorially Maine that made this, and how did that happen?
So Massachusetts isn't really interested in holding on to Maine. Maine was mostly Jeffersonian, whereas in politics, whereas Massachusetts was Federalist. But there were so many Mainers coming into the Massachusetts legislature that Massachusetts reckoned, you know what, if we eject Maine, we'll get rid of all the Jeffersonians up there, and Massachusetts will be a Federalist state forever. Lasted 4 years. But anyway, so in a way, Massachusetts wants to get rid of Maine. It's become a headache. So they do allow, there are actually a couple votes after the War of 1812, but it's the 1819 one, and people in Maine get to vote on it. And when I say people, I mean white males who own property over 21. So it's not exactly a huge mandate, but it does pass by a very comfortable margin. There are people who object. There are people who actually move to Massachusetts from Maine after statehood because they just can't stand the thought of not being in Massachusetts anymore. But that's pretty much the dynamic. Yeah. And somebody else had a question. Yes, sir.
I've read other historians about the War of 1812, and a lot of them talk quite a bit about ethnic resentment and the role of Scotch-Irish versus the English as sort of essential component of the conflict. Is there an overlay of the ethnic issue in Maine too, or not?
A little bit. Maine is more diverse than Massachusetts. I mean, there are a few enclaves of Scots-Irish. There's an enclave of Germans up in Waldoboro. And there are Irish Catholics around Damariscotta Lake. These people, if you're not of English descent and a Congregationalist, you're pretty much outside the status quo. You're on the outside looking in. And so these people automatically become Jeffersonians who don't like the idea of what Massachusetts is selling. So there is an element of that. But if you look at if you're a genealogist, boy, Maine is pretty much English descendants at that time. Unusual in that Actually, by 1810, there are only 4 Catholic churches in all of New England. 3 of them are in Maine. And the Massachusetts judiciary, though, actually as late as 1805, a Catholic priest gets arrested in Wiscasset for trying to marry a couple. And he gets thrown into jail and hauled in front of a judge who says, "You papists," and he uses that word, papists, this is not a nice word, "are here only on sufferance. So guilty, fine, $75. Yeah, really pretty ugly dynamics. And that's something Massachusetts begins to walk away. But, Massachusetts to this day, well, it's just St. Patrick's Day, right? Or wait, no, in Suffolk County it was Evacuation Day because we don't like the Irish. And we don't, so it's weird. So, yeah, good question. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I read something once about the British trying to populate coastal areas, I guess around Castine during the War of 1812 with Irish. Do you know anything about that?
So there is some misinformation out there promulgated by Wikipedia, our good friends at Wikipedia, where they're misapplying a label of New Ireland to Eastern Maine. And so during the American Revolution, there had been a couple sort of desultory plans made for creating a colony east of the Penobscot. And you can imagine what a populous and wealthy place that would have been. Not a great idea. And it never comes to anything. So before the War of 1812, every once in a while you'll get a British subaltern, a junior military officer, in the wardroom, sort of after too many glasses of port, opine that the British ought to seize everything east of the Penobscot. But there never is a formal plan. And I've seen the papers in London, I've seen papers in Ottawa and Halifax, Washington, D.C., all throughout Maine. There never was a plan for New Ireland in the War of 1812. But there's somebody who likes Wikipedia who keeps on popping that in there. And it just isn't true. It was just, for the British, it was just a military operation. We're essentially going to hold Eastern Maine ransom as a bargaining chip in the negotiations to end the war. They had no intention of staying there. They had all of British North America, all of Canada. They didn't need more underpopulated, forested places because they had plenty, right? So, yeah. Yes, sir.
2 very different questions. One, on the stuff you described about how people, were being starved and sort of the pro-war and anti-war movement, why did people come to such different conclusions? I mean, weren't a lot of those things true across the coastal United States, or was it just that the starvation you described was so much worse in Maine than it was, say, in the Mid-Atlantic? And then completely unrelated, second question about where you talk about Maine leading. I recently read an article about how several Mainers who later became politicians in Midwestern states, much like Rufus King described, but Elihu Washburn, I think was one, were so scarred by the experience of the pro-slavery Southerners in Congress holding Maine statehood ransom to Missouri that they later became very active in the development of the Republican Party in the 1850s with its anti-slavery state. So that was kind of a Maine leading example. I don't know if you can elaborate.
Sure. So with the food thing and the fact of the matter is that Mid-Atlantic states could feed themselves and Maine could not, is the basic problem. And in Maine, they call spring the starving time because, it was a long time waiting for those dandelion greens and rhubarb to come up because those are the first things you're going to be able to eat, right? So, but there is a lot of differences, and the newspaper editors from that day, I think, would translate very well into CNN and Fox. Things really haven't changed. In fact, one of my ideas from the preface is that actually the unusual period in American history was from the end of World War II till a few years ago, when I think the nation enjoyed unparalleled prosperity and happiness, and other than the civil rights movement, not much in the way of riots and unhappiness. And I think what we're looking at as the World War II generation is essentially gone now, or certainly without power at this point, that sense of unity and purpose is gone. So we're returning to a very unhappy normality.
Normality.
Yeah, I hope not, but there's a lot of moving wheels in the world these days. It's complicated. Let's see, have I answered all your questions? Oh, Republicans. Okay, so Mainers certainly do buy into that. And the anti-slavery movement, and plenty of Mainers are indeed prominent. I think one of the people you referred to was Samuel Portland Chase. People always want to call him Porter Chase, but his middle name is actually Portland because he was born in Portland and moved out to, I think, Chicago, which is right next to, very close to Dearborn, Michigan, named after Henry Dearborn, Maynard. So, and others. But I think when they do that, they're basically buying into Boston ideals. Is my sense, and that's certainly where, was it Henry Lloyd Garrison? Is his first name, or is it William Lloyd Garrison? William Lloyd Garrison, who actually hails from Passamaquoddy Bay. I think he was born on Campobello, right across the bay from Eastport. He moves to Boston, right, and becomes a leader of this movement. So, yeah. So now here's the bad news. A lot of Mainers look at the climate here like, march in Maine? No. And a lot of Mainers move to places like Alabama or Georgia, and they quite happily buy into the slavery system and plantations. In fact, they become more Southern than the Southerners, which is something, they lose their Yankee identity. And that includes a couple of brothers from Whitefield, Maine, Irish boyos, Catholic, who moved to Alabama. And actually, they are the last people to ever import an illegal cargo of enslaved Africans into the nation. And that schooner they did that on has been discovered, and archaeologists are digging or diving on that down in, was it Mississippi, I want to say. Or is it Alabama? Okay. My Gulf geography is not strong. Mainers, right? And so it is discouraging how many people are willing to buy into slavery. I mean, it is a way to quick wealth. I live on Long Island. A lot of my friends and neighbors are Jewish, and I tease them because they go, the civil rights movement, we were right there. I was like, yeah. But how many Jews were in the Confederate government? And the answer, there were two, their Secretary of State and their Secretary of Treasury, because new immigrants move where? To where the money is. And if you're hungry and desperate to get ahead, very often you're willing to oppress other people. And that could be Yankees, right? It could be Jews, it could be Germans, it could be Irish, it could be, anybody. I would also point out that the only man who was hanged for importing enslaved Africans into the country, and it is a hanging offense enforced by the U.S. Navy after 1819, where the slave trade is equated legally with piracy, and the only American hanged under this act is Alexander Gordon of Portland, Maine. So let's not be too smug about the North and the South. So, other questions? Yes, sir.
You've described, the movement of that remote territory of Maine from Massachusetts. But shortly before that, New Hampshire became an independent state. Was there any initiative to either merge for the Maine territory, to merge with them, or was it a different dynamic?
Different dynamic. So New Hampshire had been sort of a small colony that the colony of Massachusetts Bay takes over. And in fact, Massachusetts Bay, centered in Boston, is quite an aggressive little colony. For example, it absorbs the old Plymouth colony, including Cape Cod and the islands. It claims to own everything from Massachusetts Bay across the continent to the Pacific Ocean in a straight line, okay? It takes over New Hampshire temporarily. Settlers in Maine, York County and Cumberland County, cry for protection from the Native Americans, and Massachusetts sends troops up to rescue those settlers and then says, oh yes, there's a price for our help. You're now part of Massachusetts. And there isn't really anything those poor settlers can do. New Hampshire, thanks to the Wentworth family, is able to reclaim royal colony status in the 1700s. So it is an entirely independent state. It is one of the original 13 colonies, unlike Maine, which is only part of the 13 colonies because it was part of Massachusetts. So very different dynamic, looks a lot like Maine and Massachusetts in many ways, but has its own thing going on. Sort of a disaster of a state, actually. It had very small government, it was that live free or die kind of thing, and its militia was disaster. Couldn't turn out to defend Portsmouth and the Kittery Naval Yard against the British because they were just so poorly organized. So yeah, New Hampshire's a different critter. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
From a historical point of view, the Native Americans in Maine this week has gone to our legislature asking for sovereignty again. Any thoughts as a historian?
So I had a lot more stuff originally about Native Americans in here, because there are a couple of incidents that are worth relating by way of answering to you. So one of the uglier incidents covered in the book is a Penobscot man and his, I think, Mohawk wife had been living in British North America, Canada, and they came back to Massachusetts, not Maine, but old Massachusetts, where some local factory workers beat them and murdered them. Well, they thought they murdered them. The man dies, but the wife survives. And in the first court case in over 100 years, Native Americans prevail, and I think 3 guys, which include one guy who was from Frankfort, Maine, so he probably may have known the Penobscot guy, are actually condemned to death. But first they get that commuted to life, and then very shortly after that, they get sprung from prison entirely. So the Penobscots remember this, and a couple of years after the war, in a tavern in Bangor, a Penobscot man is asked by the tavern keeper to leave, closing time, always a perilous time at a bar, right? And seriously, the Native American takes offense and he stabs and kills the tavern owner. And so there is a trial in Castine, and the Native Americans get up and say, hey, this is a rigged system. We have seen our brother get murdered in old Massachusetts, and those people are now free. We think our brother should be freed. And I don't think he is. I think he actually dies in jail fairly soon after the trial. So yeah, there is no justice for the Native Americans. And it is the weird thing, another weird thing about Massachusetts is that even after the US Constitution is created and only the federal government is supposed to negotiate and make treaties with Native Americans, Massachusetts ignored that. And it made treaties directly with the Penobscots and the Passamaquoddies, and maybe the St. John Indians too. And oddly enough, never to the benefit of the Native Americans, would you believe? And Maine inherits this actually part of statehood requires them Maine to observe the treaties that Massachusetts had made with the indigenous peoples. And Maine does that, but with a twist. I think Maine also makes Native Americans wards of the state, meaning you have no legal authority. Actually, oddly enough, sailors were wards of the state too back then, so they were means you're sort of treated like a child, and you can't do things for yourself. Fast forward to the 1970s, and a lawyer fella from Eastport gets involved with this, and he has this crazy idea, hey, this was illegal, and together with the Penobscots, the Passamaquoddies, and maybe other groups, sues, and what was that, sort of 1974 or something? There's a huge decision which, Maine and Massachusetts, interestingly, are both found culpable in this, and huge swaths of Maine are supposed to be turned over to the indigenous peoples, and of course that doesn't happen. They get essentially cash instead, and the lawyer from Eastport, not long after that, ends up just a little bit dead. Yeah, very, very. I mean, he was a strange fellow, but it's not something odd there. So. I don't mean to be political, but Janet Mills, as an attorney, has been in opposition to Native American rights is generally the thing, which is interesting because I regard her as a very liberal person on the whole, and not a cruel person or anything like that. But she hasn't, as far as I can tell, really been on the right side of this question. And Native Americans are endlessly fascinating, but very perilous for a historian to go into that history because it does make a lot of people very nervous, and I don't want to end up even a little bit dead. Yes, ma'am.
Can you comment on the expression, as Maine goes, so goes the nation? Why does that exist?
No. Except I know that pundits have converted that to as Maine goes, so goes Vermont. It's actually a reference to Republican politics when virtually everybody was Republican in Maine. And there's an old joke about the Maine town where the selectmen are counting votes, and it's Republican, Democrat. Oh, Josiah voted. That's good. Republican. Democrat. Oh, that devil Josiah voted twice. So no, I don't really have anything intelligent to say. So, anybody else? Well, you've been a lovely audience, and it's been a real pleasure speaking with you, and so many of you are really fantastic. So I'm going to be signing books. I think the book is being sold by the library, and I'd be glad to sign those and chat. And if you want my business card or anything, because I can share information or documents, I'd be glad to do that. So thanks again. It's been a pleasure.
Well done. I love you.
They liked it in Boston, too. I don't know why.
So we want to thank George Emery for bringing this wonderful author to us. You're always so kind of finding really great speakers. So thank you, George.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And I knew immediately, I really admired this man. He walked in. 2 minutes later, we had him out getting books out of a car to help us with somebody making a delivery. So we got a new volunteer here.
Yeah. Love the hours.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. So thank you so much for being here with us. We've got a little swag for you.
Yay.
And I don't know if you're a cook, but this is the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook.
Oh, cool.
Forward by Janet Mills. So that is for you, and thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.
So please stick around and have some cookies, and get a book if you'd like. So thanks again.
George, I thought you might enjoy this if you haven't seen it already.